Okay, I think we're ready to begin. More folks will join us. We'll let them join. And so welcome, everybody. My name is Mari Margil. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. Joining me in presenting today is Thomas Linzey, our Senior Counsel at the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. Just a few procedural things before we get going. As you can tell, we have everybody on mute to start. And we're going to ask folks to type in questions if you want into the chat, and we'll be getting to those. But just for ease of being able to hear, we're going to put everyone on mute, and then we'll start getting to folks' questions toward the end. Today, basically what we're going to do is we want to just do a little bit of an introduction to who we are, the work that the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights is doing. I know we partner with many of you on the call. It's really nice to see people's faces. When we're going to move from there, we wanted to provide updates on what's happening in the rights of nature, some recent things you may not know about, a little bit of a timeline of how did we get where we are today, 15 years on into the rights of nature lawmaking movement. So we'll hear not only from places in the United States, but also some of the work that's occurring in different countries as well. And then we're going to do some Q&A because we know folks have lots of questions. And we see this very much as the first of many. We'll be doing this monthly, and we also offer a number of other kinds of training webinars. So we wanted to give you a feel for that as well, so that you understand that this is not intended as a one-off, that we're here to help and work with folks and engage with the work that you're doing and help as much as we can. And want to share a little bit about what that looks like as well. So just a little bit administrative again, everyone's going to be muted. Thomas and I will do a bit of presentation, then we'll get to Q&A. If you have questions, please type it in and we'll get to them, and we'll do some updates. We're going to record this so that we have it and people can share it. And I think that's it from a procedural standpoint. So let's get going. I'm going to turn things over to Thomas to start us off. I'm going to keep letting people into the waiting room, and let's get going. Thomas.
Great, thanks, Mari. So we had about 80 people sign up for this webinar, and so people are going to be coming in and out. So one thing we wanted to talk about today was that a lot of people on this webinar are new to rights of nature stuff, and we wanted to start out with an introduction to the organization that Mari and I work for, the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, so CEDAR for short. We have our webpage up in the chat module at the bottom. But basically our purpose at CEDAR is twofold. First, advancing environmental rights, so both rights of nature, this legally enforceable rights for ecosystems and nature concept, but also advancing environmental rights for people, so human rights to the environment, to a safe and healthy environment. And then second, advancing this concept of local democratic rights to advance environmental rights. And people sometimes ask, well, how are those two connected between rights of nature and democratic rights? And the answer is that most localities, most municipal governments, at least in the United States, don't allow their cities, towns, villages, or counties to actually adopt certain kinds of laws. And so from a democratic rights perspective, it's about expanding that portal, making an argument that localities, specifically municipalities like cities, towns, villages, and counties, have the legal authority to adopt both human rights to the environment as well as rights of the natural environment via rights of nature work. So we offer 6 services through CEDAR, just as an introduction today to the webinar. The first service that we offer is education, trainings, and workshops, basically talking about what is rights of nature, what do we have to do to advance rights of nature laws. Mari's going to talk more specifically about this next in terms of the different webinars that we offer, groups that are organizing around rights of nature. Second, we offer campaign and strategy development, so helping folks think through what it takes for an ordinance, local law, national constitutional amendment, national legislation to actually move through the process. The third service is legal research and legislative drafting, both in the US and internationally, in terms of figuring out what the law of a particular jurisdiction is, what a ordinance, what a constitutional amendment, what a constitutional provision might look like. So we help with that legislative drafting. Helping to build support with elected officials, attorneys, and other organizations, basically to educate those individuals and other groups about what rights of nature is and the kind of work that the community or group is doing at the international or within the United States. The fifth service that we offer is helping with public outreach and awareness building, so doing the general education work around rights of nature. And the final piece is enforcement and implementation after adoption. So once a law is adopted, what does it mean to implement it? What does it mean to enforce it? But those are the 6 things that we offer through the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mari to talk specifically about what we want to accomplish with this webinar.
So again, welcome to those of you who have just joined. We are doing monthly webinars now, and they're intended just to be this 1 hour kind of where things are sitting in the rights of nature movement. And that includes things from the local up to the national and even international level. And because we feel that very much people need to be better connected, better understanding, learning from one another, all of those good things to help all of us advance this movement. But we also offer other kinds of webinars and trainings. And I guess I should say now that we also just want to acknowledge that this is we understand this is a very difficult and strange time. We hope that everybody is safe and well. And it's, of course, moved us into a place where we love to be on the ground with folks. Thomas and I both had many meetings and conferences and strategy sessions that we were supposed to be in person with folks in March and April and so on. And we know that this is less than ideal, but we're trying to develop some training and workshops through webinars, through Zoom, that we hope will be really valuable and productive for folks. And we've already started doing some of them. And we've described them a bit on our website. I wanted to take a moment here to let you know what is possible. So we have our monthly webinar, which we're obviously starting today, and we'll continue to announce future dates. In those webinars, the intention really is just to give us a flavor of what's the latest and greatest. And we're going to begin featuring some really key voices in the rights of nature movement, people from the United States, from Ecuador, other countries that are very much in the midst of the work, so they can share their experiences, what they're learning, what strategies they find are effective or don't, so that we can all learn from that and grow the movement. We also offer other kinds of trainings and workshops through webinar format. So we have a Rights of Nature 101, and that Rights of Nature 101 is really just an introduction to what is the rights of nature, why the rights of nature, that is, why are places beginning to advance this into law and to implement and enforce it? How is it different than conventional environmental law? Why do we need to move beyond conventional environmental law? So that's a really basic, we can customize it a bit to the place where you are, whether it's a community, in a state, whether it's nationally that you're looking to move something. So it's really intended to be very much an introduction. And then we have more advanced webinars. We have what we call Rights of Nature 201 and Rights of Nature 301. Rights of Nature 201 is a 3-hour training. Rights of Nature 301 is a 6-hour training. And this is really for organizations, groups, and even governments, elected officials who at request are requesting trainings that we can customize for them that really go beyond that introduction to what is the rights of nature to the question about how do we move this forward? What strategies do we need? What kind of background do we need to understand for ourselves about what this stuff is? And how do we develop plans to move it forward, whether we're drafting legislation, introducing it, bringing it to our city council, seeking to introduce a citizen initiative, all of these different ways that we can move this forward. We address those and go deeper into Rights of Nature 201 workshop and then Rights of Nature 301, really intended to focus on how do we get campaigns off the ground. So if you're interested in those, don't hesitate to get in touch with us, and we can talk about how do we customize those for your organization, your group, whatever it might be that you're looking to bring into this conversation. And we keep those obviously much smaller than what we have today, because they're really intended to be an interactive session and we can figure out, how do we structure it to best meet your need. So don't hesitate to get in touch with us about those. And we've already started doing some of them and finding them to be really constructive and productive and beginning to move campaign strategies forward. So wanted to let you know about those. And now we wanted to move into what I would say the real meat of things. That is, a very brief, where have we been with rights of nature and where are we going? That is, what updates are happening? How do we learn more about it, and so on. So to begin, folks may know that there have been rights of nature laws in place now for almost 15 years. So 2006, we have the first rights of nature law anywhere in the world, and that's in Tamaqua Borough, a rural community in the state of Pennsylvania in eastern United States. And from there, you have communities not only in Pennsylvania, but New Hampshire, Maine, and other places in the United States begin to move these things forward, primarily because they were trying to stop threats from coming into their communities, like fracking, which I know is prevalent everywhere around the world now. But communities facing threats who found that conventional regulatory environmental law didn't provide them a means to protect themselves and their community and their environment from threats, and they moved to a rights of nature format. And so we have the first law in 2006. More than 36 laws now are locally in place in different parts of the United States, in a number of different states. And then in 2008, when we were invited to work with folks in Ecuador on their constitution, and Ecuador became the first country in the world that year to establish the rights of nature into a constitutional framework, Chapter 7, that rights of nature, Pachamama has certain rights like the right to exist, the right to regenerate, the right to evolve, the right to be restored. And from there, we have seen this growth of rights of nature in a way that honestly we did not predict. But the moment that Ecuador essentially ripped the veil off rights of nature, our phones started ringing from places like India and Nepal. And I know we have Sharlan on from Nepal, and he was one of the first persons that called after Ecuador's constitution was promulgated to say, how do we bring this into my country? And so today, as folks may know, we have national laws in place in Uganda. We have national laws in place in Bolivia. We have seen New Zealand do certain laws around certain ecosystems to recognize rights of the Wanganui River and other ecosystems. You have court decisions now declaring that certain ecosystems possess rights. We have those at state courts in India. We have that in the Constitutional Court on down in Colombia, recognizing rights of the Rio Atrato, the Amazon region, Paramos, and other ecosystems in Colombia. We have local laws now, of course, across the United States, and efforts beginning to move at the state level. We have local laws enacted now in Brazil. So we see a really exponential growth both through direct lawmaking and constitutional frameworks, as well as through courts, in which more and more nature as a whole, as well as ecosystems and species being recognized. You have tribal nations in the United States that are establishing the rights of nature into their tribal governing frameworks. So we're seeing this incredible growth in rights of nature lawmaking. We see policy making as well. So like political parties are beginning to move this into their party platforms to say, we need to begin adopting rights of nature law and making decisions that come through a rights of nature perspective. The IUCN obviously has had rights of nature as part of their framework for many years now. We start to see churches begin, like the Church of Sweden, for example, in the past year has incorporated rights of nature into their own internal education programming. The bishops in Philippines have also issued an endorsement of rights of nature. And of course, Pope Francis spoke of that a right of the environment does exist. So the point is that we're seeing real growth in the legal realm, that is through the lawmaking in courts, but we're also beginning to see it moving in sort of that cultural, societal change realm. Faith communities, scientific communities, conservation communities, others beginning to take up the rights of nature. And it's that cultural shift and that legal shift that we talk about so often that go together, which drive one another forward and really tell us that this is a movement that's really gaining a foothold all over the world. And I think we're seeing more of that, and this is my own perspective, but as we're seeing, unfortunately things get worse and with regard to the environment, with species loss, ecosystem collapse, coral reefs dying, oceans acidifying, and of course, global warming generally. More and more people I see, and government officials and courts and others are saying there has to be something more that we can do. There has to be a way to move beyond the status quo, because the status quo is obviously proving inadequate to protect nature in the way that nature is screaming at us to protect it. So the rights of nature is moving in to that void. And we're seeing, obviously not only the laws that are in place and court decisions that have been issued, but also, and we'll talk a bit more about this, but national legislation being introduced in places like Philippines and Sweden. You see state legislation being introduced, not only, as I mentioned, in the United States, but now in places like Australia, we've been working, and other efforts afoot in different countries to expand that lawmaking, to deepen the societal understanding and build support for mobilizing people across nations to get this into place. So what we wanted to do today, moving further into the agenda, is share some of the latest things that are happening in the United States, as well as outside of the United States, to give people a feel for how this is growing. And then, of course, we'll get into any questions and discussion that folks want to have. So I'll turn things over to Thomas right now, and he's going to start with some updates from the United States.
Thanks, Mari. So we have a limited amount of time on these hour-long webinars, and so what we wanted to do was not try to provide a comprehensive, here's a list of everything happening in the U.S., but really do a deep dive in 2 places. And so right now we're working primarily in 5 states. So Massachusetts, Virginia with the Virginia Network for Democracy and Environmental Rights, Minnesota, Texas, there's a nascent effort in San Antonio, and then in Florida, which has consumed quite a bit of time because there's a lot happening there. But those are the 5 states. And then there are other things happening in other places, like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Folks may have read about people of Toledo passing a Lake Erie Bill of Rights. The ordinance was struck down by a federal court. The city of Toledo is appealing it. So we can, perhaps in the questions, the chat portion at the end, we can talk about some of those specifics. But I wanted today to take time, the limited amount of time that we have, to focus down in 2 places, so Florida and Massachusetts. And we have people on the call today from both places. And again, given the limited period of time, I'm going to try to summarize a lot of what's happening. So please forgive me if I missed something or mischaracterize something. But starting with Florida, the common denominator among these different places, and Mari touched on this, is frustration with existing environmental law. That activists and organizations and communities have tried to protect ecosystems in the natural environment through using specifically environmental regulations, appealing permits issued by state agencies and national governments, and basically doing the dance of trying to protect the things that people care about through using that existing structure. And so it's been frustration with that existing structure, which has given birth to these rights of nature work across the U.S. and internationally. In Florida, it was no different. Folks have been frustrated with the lack of progress on cleaning up Florida's waterways. Folks may be familiar with the problems coming out of Florida, especially the pictures and the video of dead manatees and dead sea life on the beaches. The red tide, which is the recurring event in Florida now, blue-green algae, nutrient overload, you name it, Florida is hit with it. Basically, burgeoning population, excessive development across the state. And so in July of 2019, so July of last year, a group of people in Orange County. So when we're talking Orange County, Florida, we're talking the Orlando area, and we're not talking small. A lot of the rights of nature stuff in the US at least has taken place on a relatively small, Tamaqua Borough, Mari mentioned 2006, 7,000 people, it's relatively small. In Florida, in Orange County, you're talking a population of about 1.2 million. So 30th largest county in the United States, 5th largest county in the state of Florida. In July of last year, 2019, a group of people who were frustrated with the lack of environmental protection for waterways, specifically the Wekiva and Econlockhatchee rivers in Orange County, drafted a Bill of Rights for the 2 rivers. and introduced it to the Orange County Charter Review Commission. So this is a commission set up by the county government to look at the county charter and decide whether it needs to be amended. So what additions need to be made to the county charter, which is kind of like a local constitution for county governments in Florida. And so they introduced this Bill of Rights, which sought a shift from this environmental regulatory protection system to a rights-based system for those two rivers. The full CRC voted to refer it to a committee. The committee met a huge number of times, multitude of times over the past year. The committee decided to expand the protection offered to the two rivers so that it covered all the waters in Orange County. So not just the two rivers, but recognized rights for all of the waters in the county. Committee voted it out by a unanimous vote. And on March 4th of this year, it received a vote by the full Charter Review Committee to place it on the November ballot. So in November, God willing, that the people in Orange County will vote on this charter amendment to recognize all waters in Orange County as having legally enforceable rights. And as part of that law, part of that charter amendment as well includes rights of humans, so right to clean water for people of Orange County as well. The work in Florida has not been without controversy. The Florida House and Senate have passed Senate Bill 712. The number is unimportant, but all to say it's a preemption bill, which seeks to now stop municipalities in Florida from adopting any law that would, quote, recognize or grant any legal rights to a plant, an animal, a body of water, or any other part of the natural environment. So House and Senate voting, sending it to the governor. It's been clawed back at this point because of budgetary concerns dealing with COVID-19. May still become law, but has been pulled back from the governor's desk. But that's just an example of how legislatures, state legislatures, tend to treat the movement of these kinds of things at the local level. So the Orange County work is just a piece of what the Florida folks have been working on. There's a dozen active counties in Florida. In response to that, they've created the Florida Rights of Nature Network, which is at fron.org, FRON.org, which is up on your chat screen now. Representatives of 6 regions of the state plus one person at large form the board of directors. And the work of FRON, mostly to accelerate the work of rights of nature within Florida, also proposing a state constitutional amendment to change Florida's constitution to recognize the right of municipalities, right of communities to adopt rights of nature laws and enforce them. And FRON is also talking about a lawsuit against this preemption stuff. So the ability of the state legislature to push back by trying to prohibit cities, counties in Florida from moving forward with rights of nature legislation. And just a final point on Florida, I know we're moving kind of quickly here, and this is just to give you a snapshot of what's happening in these places, but FRON co-hosted with us, with CEDAR, a law school conference at the University of Florida Levin College of Law recently. And the focus of that one-day conference was exclusively on rights of nature. And so that added a little bit of heft, you know, a law school embracing the concept enough to have a one day of their public interest environmental conference devoted to rights of nature. And that followed on the heels of the Tulane Law School Conference and the Vermont Law School Conference that we've co-hosted. So law schools kind of coming around to embracing at least some of the concept enough to do fora and conferences around the concept of rights of nature. So what's happening in Florida is very exciting. It's almost like kind of the front lines of rights of nature stuff and continually adding new places moving behind Orange County in terms of adopting these types of provisions or proposing these types of provisions. And the second place I wanted to do a deeper dive than just the surface kind of stuff was Massachusetts. We also have people from Sheffield, Massachusetts. Think western part of the state of Massachusetts over in the Berkshire area. There's an issue kind of similar to in Florida, which is frustration with existing environmental law to fix the problems that have emerged in that part of Massachusetts, specifically focused on the Housatonic River. So just to give a little bit of background, from the 1930s to the late 1970s, General Electric, operating a plant in Pittsfield, which is also in the Berkshire area in western Massachusetts, produce things called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. They're toxic, carcinogen, cancer-causing, mostly used in the construction of insulators for electric equipment. And blew my mind recently when I looked back, because I didn't understand the full extent of the problem, but GE dumped 600,000 pounds of PCBs into the Housatonic River over a period of 40 years, and over 1 million pounds of PCBs into the Hudson River. So this widespread, extensive contamination of the rivers from PCBs, and there has been a long-running war with the EPA in terms of how to clean up those PCBs from the river. The plan is now for the EPA to excavate the PCBs from the river and create dumps for that waste in the towns along the river. And this isn't the sole reason for the rights of nature work that's been done by the Berkshire Rights of Nature group, but is one of the issues in a mix of issues, including industrial runoff, big ag runoff, all kinds of things that are affecting the Housatonic River. And so the group in Sheffield, once again in Western Massachusetts in the US, decided to advance a local ordinance and place it on their town meeting warrant. So they circulated a petition, gathered signatures, qualified the initiative, and their webpage, as Mari has put it up on the chat screen, recently launched, was supposed to be voted on May 4th, but because of the pandemic, the town meeting vote has been delayed, probably to June or July. But it will be the first, just like in Orange County, Florida, Orange County, if the people of Orange County adopt the measure in November, will be the first county to adopt a rights of nature initiative via ballot initiative. So first county in the United States. In the Berkshires for Sheffield, Massachusetts, they'll become the first community in Massachusetts to adopt a rights of nature law and do so via a town meeting article. So those are two places. There's lots of other stuff going on now more than ever. As Mari said, the work is accelerating. So we're getting calls from Oregon, a bunch of other places that are doing this kind of work. And again, the only thing I'll finish with on this update for the US is that a lot of people have asked us about the Toledo ruling, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights ruling. I just wanted to let people know that the city of Toledo has officially appealed that to the federal circuit court. And just a thumbnail of a background is people of city of Toledo passed the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. About 400,000 people were out of water because of the pollution that occurred in Lake Erie. They passed the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, recognizing that Lake Erie had certain rights. Big ag interests sued over the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, got a federal judge to overturn it. And now we're in a place where the city of Toledo has now appealed that ruling to the federal circuit court at this point. So that process could take probably about a year at this point for that to be resolved, but that's where we sit with that. So I'd like to turn it back over to Mari at this point to move from the US to the international level and talk about what's happening there.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I wanted to start to let you know that we're really pleased because here at CEDAR, we have just had Michelle Maloney, who many of you might know from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, which she is leading and continues to lead. She's also joining our team here at CEDAR. And we've been working with her for many years to bring rights of nature into Australia. And one of the conversations that Michelle and I have repeatedly, and I know I've had with some of you folks as well, everybody on this call, which is it seems that change happens really slowly. And we've talked a lot about in Australia why that is. She does tons of education and webinars and workshops. She's been on the ground with communities all across the country, as well as meeting with First Nations, with elected officials, others. And one of the things that we talk about, which I think is a theme throughout this work, is that we're talking, as much as we talk about the need to make legal lawmaking change, we're also talking about that need to make cultural change. And that those two things kind of work together to move things forward. And that's, the history of people's movements show us that cultural shift is essential to making that legal shift and vice versa. And so we've had some frustration over the years, just that it feels, that Michelle says it feels like things are moving so slowly here. And I have to give her a great deal of credit, and I'm sorry it's very late there, so she wasn't able to join us for this webinar today, but she's going to be working with us on webinars going forward and the work that she's doing and building in Australia. But I wanted to share with you some of the things that have happened in Australia, which suddenly seems like, you know, you're waiting very patiently, and then all of a sudden, you know, some stuff starts to happen. And that, I think, is very much to a credit to her and the work she's been doing with her group to really bring and introduce this idea of rights of nature into the country and into the dialogue. So several things have happened that I wanted to share. Number one, last November, Michelle and I worked with a member of parliament in West Australia, in the West Australia Parliament, that's a state parliament there, who was interested in introducing rights of nature legislation into the state level there, and worked with her, Member of Parliament Diane Evers, to draft legislation on the rights of nature. And she introduced it toward the end of November, and that's the first rights of nature legislation introduced anywhere in the country of Australia. And so that in itself is a really key milestone. And it includes specific rights of not only communities and people, but also specific rights of First Nations. It includes obviously specific rights of nature, but provides that First Nations have a particular authority to enforce that and defend it. It includes specific language around precaution in terms that you don't need scientific certainty in order to make decisions on behalf of and to protect the rights of nature. In addition, and this has become more of the dialogue, and I know this has been some of the conversation in Florida as well as other places that we're working, that, you know, this idea that nature possesses rights, and a lot of talk about things like legal personhood and does nature have rights and responsibilities. The Australian state legislation, we specifically included provisions that state that the conferral of rights onto nature within this legislation does not mean that nature possesses duties or obligations or responsibilities. So to ensure that those rights are protected, and that suddenly we're not suing a river for flooding and causing someone injury. So that those two things that are really, really critical, that nature has these rights and that you essentially can't hold those rights against nature, that those are to be protected and upheld, and our actions need to be consistent with those rights, including specific provisions to ensure that you don't have efforts to try to undermine those rights by saying that nature is failing in its obligation. So that's a very, very big conversation, and I think we might want to be dedicating one of the webinars to that tension that between, you know, what is legal personhood and what does that mean, and what does rights of nature mean, and where do those two things meet? But we're beginning to address that specifically in legislative drafting. So I wanted to just raise that. We'll have more conversation about certainly moving forward, and we can talk about it with folks one-on-one as well. The other thing that's happened in Australia, which I think is really important, because again, it's another marker. Michelle has spent a lot of time with different communities across the country. She brought us in to do a speaking tour, I think in 2012. We went to places like Margaret River and other communities. One of the places that she's been working a lot in is in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, not far from Sydney. And just in the last few weeks, the mayor of Blue Mountains and the city council took a step, the first time we've seen this happen in any community anywhere in Australia. And what they decided was that they agreed to consider and investigate further how to incorporate the rights of nature into decisions about future operations within the community and future local planning in the community. So essentially taking the rights of nature and thinking, how do we build this into the kind of things that we do at the municipal level, the kind of decision making that we need to make that's going to have some impact on the environment. That's the first time this has happened in Australia. So it's local, it might seem small, but it's actually a very big step forward. And what we have seen is that even as that legislation was introduced into Western Australia in November, and even as this stuff in Blue Mountains is beginning to help, you start seeing other people raise up, saying, hey, we want to learn about this. Michelle's getting a lot of calls, in the process of doing some work around like the Darling River, for example, and other places in Australia. So it's slow, but it's about, building, having the expectation it's going to be slow and needing to drive that dialogue and that education and public awareness raising forward. And you begin to see the fruits of that labor. So we're going to be seeing, I'm sure, a lot more. Michelle's working like crazy. And so we're just really happy to have her as part of our team. And we see a lot that's going to happen in Australia over the next year as well. So we'll be continuing to bring that news to all of you. So I'll move from there to South Asia. In March, I was supposed to be in New Delhi for a Rights of River dialogue, in which people from places like Bangladesh and Nepal and India as well coming together to talk about what does this look like. And so that's a big conversation that's happening in that region. You had the state courts in India recognizing rights of the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. You have Bangladesh's all of Bangladesh's rivers now have been recognized as possessing rights. You have efforts afoot, of course, in Nepal, where we've been working for quite a while. And so trying to figure out what does it mean to recognize rights of rivers within that region? What about transboundary issues? There's even conversations about having a broader conversation about, do we need to begin to look at things from a bioregional level in terms of shifting national boundaries? So there's big conversations about democratic and environmental rights, and of course rights of nature happening there. Specifically in Nepal, I wanted to say, Shravan Sharma has been on this call on our webinar today. He's somebody that we've been working with for over a decade. He's with the Center for Economic and Social Development based in Kathmandu. In March, again, supposed to be in Nepal, working with him to meet with politicians, elected leaders, members of parliament, a conversation and dialogue that we've been having there for quite a long time, to try to bring rights of nature into their statutory and potentially constitutional framework in Nepal, that they have this new constitution in place now. And of course, in Nepal, one of the biggest concerns, I should say, but a huge concern there is climate change. The Himalaya are the fastest warming mountain region on Earth. And everything literally is downstream in Nepal from the mountains, which form the northern border. And so we have developed a Rights of Himalaya legislative framework. We've been educating and raising awareness with members of parliament and talking with them about introducing this kind of legislation into parliament, working with elected officials from districts within the Himalayan region, who of course have a very special concern about this for their region, for their people, for their food subsistence, and so on. And so that work is continuing. Sharon has been doing an incredible job of engaging with elected leaders there, and hopefully we'll be able to have him as a featured speaker on one of the webinars going forward as well. So I'll leave that there for now. I want to move to some other places. One is, Thomas mentioned that the University of Florida, that you had the law school conference in February. In March, we had a law school conference at University of British Columbia School of Law and Vancouver, and that of course was supposed to be in person, moved online, but it comes out of almost a year now of working with folks in British Columbia in Western Canada to talk about how do we bring rights of nature into provincial law in British Columbia. And so one of the ways that we're beginning to do engagement and outreach and education around rights of nature has been working with faculty and students at the University of British Columbia School of Law, and with students doing research around, well, what would it look like? What are the different legislative vehicles? What are the different lawmaking vehicles that we can use to move rights of nature forward within the provincial framework there? One of the outcomes of that was this day-long set of meetings that we had and strategy sessions in March. Again, supposed to be in person, but nonetheless, one of the groups that's formed out of this and that we're partnering with is Rights of Nature British Columbia, or Rights of Nature BC, and we're going to continue that work to explore these different things, building allies, reaching out to non-traditional allies, and seeing what could it look like, whether we do that within the British Columbia provincial level or maybe something sub-provincial, but that work is just beginning, and so we'll keep you updated on that. Other places that have real things happening, of course, in Philippines, as I mentioned, we've been working for well over a year with the Philippine-Miss River Partnership, or you might know it as PMPI, on national legislation on rights of nature. And that legislation was introduced in, I think it was early October of last year, into the Senate of Philippines, so the first legislation in the country introduced on rights of nature, and now we're also working on local, what a community rights of nature template might look like. And so that work is continuing as well. They've been doing an incredible job of doing marches and other kinds of meetings and conferences to raise awareness around this. I've been working with the bishops there to bring in faith communities. So that work is continuing, and it's really robust. They're going to be doing some webinars as well, so hopefully we'll be able to participate and share that with folks so we can learn about that. Other places, like in Sweden, we worked on a constitutional amendment which was introduced into the Riksdag last October. Member of Parliament Rebecca Lemoyne, who we've been working with to draft that constitutional framework to establish that into the constitution or the instrument of government in Sweden. So that's been introduced. Groups like Loden and Rights of Nature Sweden, who we are partnering with, are doing a lot of public awareness raising, education around rights of nature generally in Sweden, but particularly focusing on Lake Batern. And that lake is one of the largest lakes in the country, has been impacted by pollution, agriculture, military operations. And so they're doing a lot of work to raise awareness to what would it look like to recognize rights of this lake, this really important ecosystem, and gathering efforts around that. The last place I want to mention today internationally is Ecuador. As I mentioned, Ecuador has had rights of nature in its constitutional framework since 2008, so over a decade now. As folks may know, there hasn't been a lot happening on the implementation side. What I mean by that is it's barely been incorporated into their environmental decision-making and governance. What's really happened in that, in the absence of that, has been that people have been going to court, filing cases to try to protect and stop bad things from happening to ecosystems, to rivers, to species in Ecuador. And courts, including from the Constitutional Court on down, have been issuing decisions affirming that nature possesses certain rights. There's a case that we filed amicus in which the court is trying to sort of fill out what the content of those rights, what do those rights really mean? What does the right to exist mean? What does the right to regenerate mean? What does the right to be restored mean? And we're awaiting that decision. Things have obviously been delayed everywhere, including in Ecuador in the judicial system. But we'll see what that looks like. In the meantime, the National Assembly, their parliament, has been undergoing a review of environmental laws, the major national environmental laws within Ecuador for several months now. And we're engaging with the National Assembly on that, specifically their environmental committee. And I'm really pleased to let folks know that we have brought onto our team Hugo Echeverria, who's an attorney in Quito, who we've been working with for a long time, and he's now part of CEDAR's team, doing some really significant work with us to talk with the Assembly and meet and provide input to the Assembly as they undergo this review of environmental laws, including their what they would call their Organic Code on the Environment, or CODA, which is similar, if folks are familiar, like in the United States, you have the different laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, things like that, that sort of are the governance instruments on the environment that talk about how do we do an environmental impact assessment, how do we issue permits for those wanting to conduct activities that will have some impact on nature. And so that's similar to the kind of law that we're looking at in Ecuador, and providing input and helping them to develop provisions about what does it look like if we begin to incorporate rights of nature in a really meaningful, robust way to guide governance decisions within the country of Ecuador. That is, how do we move not only from just taking cases to court to try to enforce the rights of nature, but how do we begin to move to an implementation so that our environmental decision making is actually shifting to recognize that nature possesses these constitutional rights, and that human activity, human decision making, governmental, environmental decisions need to be consistent with that. So things like, how do we do a rights of nature EIS, or environmental impact assessment, or environmental impact statement? How do we move from making individual piecemeal decisions when we're thinking about issuing a permit, for example, to a corporation to conduct mining? How do we move from those being individual sort of piecemeal decisions to a more holistic decision making, so that we consider our actions, human actions, governmental decisions, in a way that we recognize that what we do in one place can have significant impacts somewhere else. So direct impact versus indirect. That are, I mean, it sounds silly to have to say this out loud, but everything is connected. but we make decisions as if everything is not. And so beginning to move to an environmental governance structure, we think that Ecuador, of course, in the national constitution, highest form of governance there, that there really needs to be a multi-year, probably multi-decade phase in process in any country that puts us into national law, whether constitutional framework or statutory, to phase in how are we going to move to a rights of nature form of governance, so that our actions are not only not harming nature or violating the rights of nature, but we're actually moving to a place where our actions are about protecting nature. That is making that fundamental shift in how we live on the planet. And so we're deep into that process now. We're doing a lot of legal research and analysis of existing laws, how those have worked, looking at things like, what does it really mean to evaluate whether or not a right of nature has been violated. So doing things like, how do we establish standards to assess whether a right of nature has been interfered with? That's very deep. We've been working with biologists, lawyers, others to develop that. And we'll be submitting some materials to the National Assembly probably later this month with proposed provisions for their national environmental law to shift that governance. And so that's work that we're continuing to do, and we think is going to have to be ongoing from here in a very big way. And so hopefully we'll be able to announce some projects around that in the near future. So I'm going to stop there. I know we have about 10, 12 minutes left. We wanted to make sure that there was some time for questions. There will be more that we can share over time, and we don't want folks to feel like, again, that this is, one and done. We welcome your contacting us, letting us know what questions you have. How do you want to do this in your communities? What kind of trainings we can do? And for now, let's move to see if there are questions. If folks want to type in questions, we can address them that way. Or if you're interested in more information about something, please let us know.
And just to add a couple other smaller things as people are coming up with the questions and typing them in. But one of the questions that was asked earlier was about political parties. So Mari had mentioned some political parties that had integrated rights of nature into their political planks for their platform. One is the Green Party of England and Wales, which has written rights of nature directly into the party platform. Another one is the Florida Democratic Party, which, and I think Mel is on this call, she was responsible for that one in Florida, but the supporting rights of nature work in Florida through the Florida Democratic Party, which formally added a plank into their platform, recognizing support for rights of nature work. And then out of the blue, we got a request from someone working with the Democratic National Committee in the US, so the DNC. To my shock, in 2016, the Democratic National Committee actually put rights of nature in an indigenous framework into their platform. So for the National Democratic Party, it exists today in that 2016 platform. For the 2021, they're looking at trying to expand it beyond the indigenous framework into rights of nature for all municipalities and supporting rights of nature laws. So that's an interesting development as well. And then akin to the international work, we've been working a lot with tribes, so tribal nations in the US specifically. And there are 4 tribes that have taken steps to both begin to adopt rights of nature into their constitutional tribal frameworks, as well as ordinances within the general legal framework for tribes. But those 4 are the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin, the Yurok tribe in California, which recently adopted a law recognizing the Klamath River as having rights, the Ojibwe White Earth Nation. So in Minnesota, folks may have read about the Rights of Wild Rice law that they passed with our assistance. And so recognizing that wild rice as a species of plant, in this case a sacred species for the Ojibwe, adopted a provision dealing with protection in a rights-based frame for wild rice on the White Earth Nation. And then most recently, the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin adopting rights of nature into their tribal legal frameworks. And so I think that work has expanded greatly over the past couple of years. I think it's going to expand and accelerate even more. But we do customized trainings for tribes because the legal framework is different, that tribes really sit in a different position than cities, towns, villages, and counties in the US. And so working with them to figure out that tribal legal overlap and how rights of nature can move within those tribal jurisdictions as well. So that's an important piece, I think.
Thank you, Thomas. And so I just want to let folks know, I've added the email address that you can contact us at, our web address if folks haven't had a chance to visit that. And I see, let's see, we have a question from Lena. And she says, I'm very curious about these points about the enforcement of rights of nature and what that could look like at a governance, holistic level. Would it be possible to hear more about the ways that those rights are interpreted? Yeah, I can speak briefly to that, and it's a big topic. So I'm sorry that it got sort of short shrift here. But you know, I try to pull apart two things. One is enforcement of rights, and when I'm saying enforcement, generally what I am talking about is, you know, if we're wanting to go into court to defend and enforce existing rights that nature has, so the right of nature to be restored, or the right of nature to be able to regenerate, the right of nature to even exist and to thrive, sort of those basic core rights. And then in places like Florida, you have you know, legislation being proposed, things like the right of nature to abundant clean water, you know, really specific rights to particular kinds of ecosystems like waterways and rivers. In places like Colorado, you have communities that have established things like a right to a healthy climate for nature. So there are different rights. And filling out what those rights mean is a role that courts certainly can play. But you know, so that's the enforcement realm about going into court and seeing what courts do with it. But then there's also, as I mentioned, what I think of more as implementation, that is government taking proactive action to implement how the rights of nature works into environmental decision making. And I like to draw a parallel because I think it's helpful. Sometimes we don't always have a quick idea of what that literally means. So I'll take a United States example, which is when we had, in the 1960s, we had civil rights legislation going through to protect the rights of African Americans. One of those rights was a right to vote, and proactive steps needed to be taken by government to ensure that people could actually exercise their right to vote. Things like making sure that there were places to vote, that there wasn't discrimination occurring on the election day. So actual, real, concrete steps to ensure that people could exercise their right to vote. So it wasn't enough to just have the words on paper. Similarly, in Ecuador, as we're talking about what implementation legislation might look like, real concrete steps about, like, for example, if you're thinking about if a corporation applies to set up a mine in Ecuador, that there you could see on paper real concrete set, like a decision-making tree. Like, will this have an impact on nature? Yes. What would that impact be? Does it rise to a certain level? And if we can determine what those legal rights actually mean and how to evaluate them, like, does nature possess, a right to regenerate? What does that mean? That means that nature has a right to be resilient, meaning it has a right to be able to recover from impact without human intervention. Does it have that level of health and well-being? How do we meant to be able to evaluate that? And so making, you can think about it in a proactive way. If government has a means, a criteria for itself, decision trees for itself to evaluate, like a mining project, for example, then you begin to get into real life practical steps to implement this so that we are not interfering with those rights. And it's a bigger conversation, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, is how do we establish processes and decision making such that we are making sure that not only are we not hurting nature, but that we're actually beginning to fulfill the rights that nature possesses in places like Ecuador and elsewhere.
So we had a question about rights of nature rulings preventing fossil fuel infrastructure projects. I think the best parallel to draw with that, and it probably a separate call in itself because this gets very, into the weeds kind of thing, but that the wild rice law passed by the Ojibwe White Earth Nation that it recognizes that wild rice on the reservation has a right to a certain kind of climate, a life-supporting climate, healthy climate, because over the next 50 years, it's projected that the climate change, global warming, is going to drive wild rice out of the reservation and further north. And so the concept that we've been talking with the lawyers about for the White Earth is that we should be using the wild rice law and that guarantee, that right to a clean, healthy, stable ecosystem, should be used to sue Enbridge, which is the company trying to put in the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, which technically is off reservation. But a big piece of the rights of nature stuff is really extra jurisdictional, that if ecosystems have rights in a particular place, they can be enforced against activities that would violate those rights, even though they take place outside of the jurisdiction that has adopted the law. And that may sound foreign to us sometimes, but that's how human rights work. If you have human rights within a particular locality, activities outside of that locality can affect your human rights. And so it means viewing rights of nature in the same lens as human rights in some ways. I think that the jurisprudence that we're going to see over the next 50 years, 20 to 50 years on rights of nature, probably not going to come out of Western courts, like federal courts or state courts under this Western system of law that we have, that probably tribal courts are going to be a fertile place for enforcement of this type of thing. But the sky's the limit in terms of rights of nature laws being applied directly in a judicial sense outside of the governmental implementation sense that Mari's been talking about. But in addition to that, that courts extending and interpreting rights of nature laws to stop specific projects occurring outside of those jurisdictions that have adopted those laws. And from a lawyer's perspective, and I had this conversation yesterday with Jim May, who heads up a group, and I think Aaron's on this call too, Dignity Rights International, about real life practical examples of enforcement of rights of nature laws. Internationally, we have those. Ecuador is the place where the nugget of those enforcement in a judicial context has taken place around rights of nature, but here in the US, it's pretty thin. We've had 2 cases where we've made intervention motions on behalf of ecosystems. So both in Pennsylvania, one on behalf of the Little Mahoning watershed, another one on behalf of a place called Crystal Spring Ecosystem. Both were eventually denied. They were attempts to intervene into existing cases. But what was fascinating to me is for a long time, the judge allowed the ecosystem to participate in oral argument, for example, for a 4-month period of time. So the victories are small, but that's the type of incremental steps that I think will eventually lead to bigger stuff. And not to hold it out as a case example, but we had litigation that was filed, the Colorado River as a plaintiff a couple of years ago against the state of Colorado and other states that were violating or signing these interstate compacts, which basically dewatered the Colorado River. I think eventually we will see not only tribal enforcement of these rights of nature laws, Western court enforcement of rights of nature laws, but also cases brought without any legislative framework whatsoever, in which lawyers are asking courts to recognize that certain ecosystems have rights completely divorced from whether any legislation's been passed at all. At the local or state level. So I think those are the three places that we're trying to encourage forward movement on rights of nature, practical enforcement stuff.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there because we're at the hour mark. We want to thank everybody very much for joining us. As we mentioned, we're going to be doing these monthly, so we'll soon announce our date in June and future dates as well. Again, as we mentioned, we have different trainings, the Rights of Nature 101, 201, and 301, from most basic to very advanced in terms of developing and launching campaigns. Don't hesitate to contact us about that. We'll be making the recording available very soon. And don't hesitate to get in contact with us directly if you have more questions, you want to talk about what this might look like with your group and your community and so on. Really look forward to those conversations. So again, thank you very much to everybody, and we'll all be in touch very soon. Thank you.